Ian, why did you even bother to study Jung as a psychologist? He's not easy. Why did you put in the effort?
Well, it's a long story, but it's not so much the why, it's the what. And how I came across Jung, who had been lurking in the background from my 20s, but I'd never read him. And probably my late 30s, I was involved with there were spiritualist type people, mediums and so on. I wasn't really into it, but I was involved in that circle. And she taught the tarot and all sorts of things. And one day she gave me a book and said, "You might be interested in this." And it was Jung's Secret of the Golden Flower, which is an Chinese alchemical text and interpretation. And it just grabbed me. So I started reading. And then it was just that one thing led to another. Now, the basic thing is that what I read in Jung had meaning to me. It's hard to say why it has meaning, but it grabbed me. It felt meaningful. And the more I read, the more interesting it became, because so much I could agree with as seeming to understand. And there were other things in there that I thought, I have no understanding of what this man's talking about. I can't comprehend it. Then I realized that I had to live in order to understand it. And that has proved true in the, 25, 30 years since. The more I've learned, the more I've understood in a very deep way. And then doing my own analysis, which again happened. I wasn't really seeking it out, but it happened to me. And this is so much in my life has happened to me. And it's been my response to what has happened, not that I've tried to make things happen or that I've gone searching for this or that. Although I think I probably have a naturally questing nature or character, innate, if you like.
Yeah.
But one thing led to another, and I came across a Jungian analyst and worked with her for 2 years. And while I was there, I thought, well, why don't I go to Zurich and see what's going on there? And so I applied to the Jung Institute and was accepted, and then I got there and applied for training, and they accepted me. Now, none of these things should have happened. And even they were surprised that they accepted me. But, you know, that's a fact, that happened. And then I continued there with the training, which is based on the analysis, your own analysis. And then, of course, my dream stopped. With a bang, rather a bang.
So you'd been dreaming quite extensively up until that point?
Yes, yeah. Well, it's interesting, because I started dreaming in 1980, and by that time I was, 37, 38. And I remember the first dream. It was absolutely devastating. I mean, it sent me to bed for a night and a day. It was truly shocking. And I dreamed intermittently for the next few years until I went into analysis, and I really started dreaming, 2 or 3 every night. And that went on for about 3 years. And then suddenly, another enormous dream, which stopped the process. So I then had to really consider what I was doing in Zurich, why I wanted to train, because it's terribly expensive, and so on and so forth. And at that point I decided, no, now is probably the time, and this took about 9 months for me to work out, to come back to New Zealand. I've been away 4 years, and just see what would happen in life. So I came back here, started the Jung Foundation, started doing seminars and lecturing, and then people wanted to come and see me and consult me, because I hadn't actually finished the training in Zurich, so I never got any certification or anything like that. But then I've never been certified for anything I've done in life, so to me that's quite normal. And then life just goes on. But I don't know whether that really answers the question. And Why Jung and why not somebody else? Possibly because he's the one that came along.
Well, there is Freud, of course.
Oh yes, yeah.
Why didn't he come along?
Well, he comes with Jung, of course. You know that when they were together, Freud and Jung was more Freudian than Freud was. But the interesting thing from my perspective is that Jung actually provided the experimental scientific basis for Jung's ideas. Because Freud had an idea, and this is what Jung says. When Freud had an idea, that was it. The idea became a fact. But Jung had done all his association experiments and all so on and so forth, and been working in the psychiatric field, which Freud never did, because Freud was a neurologist before becoming a psychoanalyst. And of course Freud expected that Jung would take over. He nominated him Crown Prince, and Jung didn't like that idea at all. So inevitably there was a parting of the ways. But Jung always gave full credit to Freud for what he'd discovered and what he'd started, what he'd set going. He didn't have to agree with him. But to understand Jung, you have to know Freud, but then you have to know Adler, and you have to know everything else about all the studies of psychology. But more than that, then you have to know history, and you have to know philosophy, and you have to know mythology and fairy tales and alchemy, and you study primitive religions and customs and ethnology and science and the modern, the latest, not just the oldest knowledge that mankind has, but everything that's the very latest, because it all has a relevance to understanding the psyche, which is what Jung was interested in. And what psychology means, study of the psyche.
Yes.
But most psychologies today are studies of human behaviour. Forget the psyche, just what people do and how they do it. And even Freud was stuck on the sexual theory and said that's basic. And Jung said, no, there's more than that. That's one form of an energy, of a psychic energy, but there's much more to it than that.
Yes, Jung once said that for modern man, the study of the psyche is more or less the only thing that can save us. Not just the individual, because people sometimes understand that unless they come to terms with their own psyche, they're going to have a crack up.
Yes.
That's the individual, we can understand that, and some people label that as quite negative, and there's still a bad tone around that,
yes,
which I'd like to talk about later. But Jung said no more, it's not just an individual thing, it's very much a social wide thing, and in terms of global problems, the answer for Jung was that we had to, as a collective, come to an understanding of a collective psyche, and surely that's Jung's greatest contribution, that he contributed the understanding that every human carries a collective psyche as well as an individual personal one.
Yes, they join up, you know, they're not distinct. It's hard to say what Jung's greatness was. To me, it's his whole idea of wholeness, which also it means something very special in Jungian terms. But that everything is related to everything else, but not indiscriminately. And because at the end, the last 20 years of his life, from the war to when he died in 61, the nuclear threat was the great danger, and that's why Jung says, you know, that the world hangs on a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man. Because what if something goes wrong with the psyche? Then we could destroy the whole world. You know, it takes a moment of madness, someone pushes the button, the bombs go off, and at that time it could have been catastrophic. You know, to me the miracle is that that didn't happen. But this is why I think Jung attracted me, because he was interested in the wholeness of life, not just in neuroses and psychoses and all the things that are wrong with life. He was interested in everything that was right with life. And that equally is psychology. But in most therapies, it's only to do with what's wrong, you know. But it goes so much further. The thing of the individual and collective is so important because it's only the individual person who can do anything, or know anything, or say anything. But Jung's whole point about individuation, and that's what he called the process one goes through, and hopefully what an analysis assists with, is that you become what you were meant to be. Now, what on earth is one meant to be? You know? Well, it's not what you think you would like to be. And it's not what anybody has ever told you that you should be. It's another process altogether of finding out what you are and where you fit. And usually we find that where we fit is very, very small. And it's not, you know, immediately I feel I should say like a cog in a machine, but it's not like that at all, because it's not mechanical. It's dynamic and living. And as I can talk to you now, while I'm doing this, I can't be talking to anybody else. Now, if this is shown wherever, others will see it, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is what's happening now, right now. And what effect it will have, we don't know. But, in all this, of course, you have to always remember the shadow. What's the shadow of talking about these sorts of things? Well, in part it could be that people misunderstand or get the wrong idea, or don't like it and so they reject it. Now that's a great danger too. And Jung said, well, you can't really worry too much about that. But in regard to that, you can do everything you can to be as complete as possible, to be as conscious as possible of what you do.
Well, I'd like to bring out 2 points there. One that you said, you know, lots of people say, to thine own self be true. You know, the greatest knowledge is knowledge of oneself. Know thyself. And what and Jung was saying the same thing, but in a much more holistic way. But his conclusion was that the self is small. You said you used the word small. Can you elaborate on that? Because that's probably quite hard for a lot of people to hear, that they're small.
Well, Jung uses the word self in a very particular way, and in later times most Jungian writers put a capital S for the self, and the self is not myself, it's not I, it's not ego, it's the greater personality that we also are. Don't forget the also. And it's very hard to understand. But yes, Jung said all those things. They're philosophical ideas, or, you know, to your own self be true. They came from philosophers, or they're attributed to philosophies, and it's called a philosophy of life. Well, the thing is that you have to also learn to not be true to yourself. There, you see. Now this is what Jung discovered, and that is part of life. At times you have to forget yourself and the self, and what's right and what's wrong, and do what has to be done. And you could say that's the shadow side of it, which you have to incorporate. So it's not only to thine own self be true, but you have to be true, let me see, to your history.
To the self.
To your culture. To life. You have to be true to that. And sometimes that being true has got nothing to do with truth, or being right, or any of those wonderful concepts. It can be often totally different. It's the same as most people get a good idea and they feel, I must do something about it, I must go and save the world. Well, sometimes the most important thing to do is to do nothing. And fight that urge to do, and not do what you're supposed to do, or what these philosophies or political correctness would tell you to do. And retire into yourself. Now that's a universal phenomenon. People have always retired from the world for various reasons. But sometimes that is to save yourself. But sometimes it's to save the world from you. No. If only some of these leaders that we have would retire and do nothing, then something might happen. Because if you do retire, I mean, it's the same as retreat in Buddhism and God knows where, everywhere. And the doing nothing, of course, is not idly sitting around smoking dope or anything like that. It's really doing nothing, and that's really hard work because we're not trained to do it. But something is going on, and that's the psyche. And then it can inform you what to do if there's anything to be done. But you see, there's it's so interesting because the development of consciousness, and our ability to do things, it's developed over millennia. You know, it clearly has. But over the past few thousand years, consciousness has developed really at the expense of other aspects of life, particularly in the Western world. And as Jung said, perhaps that's necessary. Perhaps you have to put other things aside. Like you have to put the man had to put the feminine aside. The masculine had to put the feminine aside in order that the masculine could develop sufficiently. But at some time it's got to come back together to include it. And because we're a very impatient people, because consciousness thinks it knows what's right. But when we should come back, when this wholeness should happen, we don't know. And if you do it too soon, then the ground is not prepared. It's the same as having elections in Iraq. I mean, democracy works in a peaceful society. It comes out of that. When people are free to speak, then you can have people speaking. But to impose it into a war zone, it strikes me that it's not the right time. But it's a fact. We have to deal with it. There's no point saying it shouldn't happen. But to me it seems inappropriate at this time.
Would that come from, I mean, I'm fond of writing articles on the Planet website about the effect of the shadow on various leaders, the favourite one being, of course, George W. Bush. I feel that he's almost in the grip of a shadow, but he doesn't know it.
Well, yes. I mean, there's several things in there. There's the not knowing it. Now, this growth of consciousness, development of consciousness, is not just accumulation of knowledge or accumulation of what one should do or the right things to do, but it's also an understanding of what that means. Not just that democracy is good, but what is democracy? What does it mean? Where does it come from? How can you use it? Where should it be used? Is it appropriate everywhere? And so on and so forth. But when they get caught by a good idea, and this is utopian idealism in a way, now, anybody can have an idea, I want to do something, but to have the energy to do it and to carry it out is a totally other thing. And where does that energy come from that allows you to do it? And that seems to be a psychic energy. Because you have all the physical energy you need, but what is it that gets you to do that and gets other people to come along with it and agree with it? And it can be either a good thing or a bad thing. Energy is neutral. For instance, you know, people say love is the greatest energy, greatest force there is. Some people say that. Well, actually, anger is a greater energy. And that's why I love it when I get angry. I can do anything then. But because I know and understand that anger is just an energy, that if I can get the energy out of the negative of it, then I can do something positive. So you get furious at somebody's misunderstanding, and if you capture the energy, then you can write a book about it and it becomes positive. You don't go out and hit somebody or start killing people because you're angry. So I don't know whether that helps, but people get this great idea that we must exterminate evil from the world. Well, that's archetypal. And it's time they stood up and said, no, let's use that, what has become negative. It needs to be transformed, not eliminated.
So, yes, it is a bit of a minefield, but to try and just, perhaps I can, for me, try and clarify it. The essence that's coming out there is that there is parts of our psyche which we don't know about, but which nevertheless contain a tremendous amount of energy. And Jung perhaps called that the unconscious. And parts of that unconscious could be personal, due to our own unique history, etc., but parts of it are also social and what he called archetypal, that they, lots of people have that in them as well. And the thing is, if you don't bring some sort of a consciousness that you have that in you, then those energies emanating from those parts of the psyche which you don't understand, but nevertheless the energy is coming out, that could well grip you and control your life. You could be out of control, literally out of control, due to these unconscious forces. Well, that's
most of the time I think we are.
Well, that's my point. I see so much of that.
But yes, and so, but if you take the idea, okay, at times in my life I'm out of control, what do you do with it? Do you repress it, or do you allow it to guide you? It's like falling into the river. I mean, do you fight against it, or do you go with the current, and how far do you let it take you, and things like that. But you see, this, in our times, this has become acute because of the growth of ego consciousness, which is quite different from just consciousness, just having an awareness. It's blithely talked about, it's very hard to understand and even harder to explain. But the idea of the I, now many people do not know who they are because they often have identified with their persona. That is what they want, the way they want the world to see them, and often it's identification with their profession. Now that has been challenged, or was challenged in the 20th century. But even today you will see that young people develop a persona. It's necessary psychical function. It's the interface between us and the world. The way we want the world to see us, the way the world wants to see us. Like the good child, the biddable child. And the child develops a persona which is nice and biddable. Okay? And keeps its shadow hidden as much as possible until it becomes a teenager. And then until it becomes middle-aged, when it all comes up again, all the everything that's not lived at various times wants to come up into life. We have no control over it. But if we're aware of that and take the time to consider it and integrate the differences into life, you can't integrate everything, but it's integrating the knowledge of it or the consciousness of it as much as anything, and then it begins to work in a positive way for us. But that's the individual, but it's the same. You can look at it as in a family level. There's a family level of the psyche. These are not disconnected. But then there's the group or the culture, and then possibly the nation or the tribe, as it was. All levels of consciousness, all collective in some way. And then there is the basic level, which is just the collective unconscious, which is common to all humankind. And we don't know where it ends or where it starts. We can only have some idea of it. So there are all these levels, and each individual lives in all these levels. So it's a huge and, to me, fascinating thing.
Well, it's not only...
I mean, I understand only so much of it, and I've still got the rest of my life, but I'll never understand it all.
It's not just fascinating, though, it's deeply practical.
practical, of course.
It's
and
incredibly practical in your life. Otherwise, you're this thing out of control. You do stuff. You later on you say, "Why did I do that?" And why didn't I do that? And generally, your life feels like this thing which is just gets away on you. You don't know what it is. You just don't. And we like to be in control. We like to have some control, which is a good thing. And yet we don't. And I think Jung is providing some of the mechanisms and understandings for us to gain more control, not only over our own personal lives, and that can be control to do nothing, but also this is applicable, as you said, to the group consciousness, particularly at the political level, where the power of the group human being now is to almost wipe life off the face of the earth, although I think that's overdoing it. I don't think even humans are that powerful that they could wipe the face of the earth clean of life. But
because we don't know why, and you can't really find out, can you?
No, but Jung provided those tools, and that's why I would like people to understand again, and me, and as much as possible, because I feel threatened by that group consciousness. I might come to some understanding of my own personal consciousness and feel quite at home and much more relaxed and about my own life. But the group consciousness in the world today appears to be tremendously threatening to every individual, and so I think Jung, somehow there has to be some understanding and acceptance of what Jung's saying in the group level, as opposed to just this.
Yes, I don't think it's collective consciousness itself that's threatening. It's what it doesn't know is what's threatening. Fear is always, this may sound radical, but fear is only of what is unknown. And if you think you do know it, then look for what you don't know in the situation that you're afraid of. And the unknown, of course, is the psyche, the unconscious. And that's raw power.